Let's begin our coverage with CNN's Caitlin Collins, still in Belgium, where the president just departed. Caitlin.
Yeah, John, the president making several stunning statements during that last-minute press conference, which was not on the schedule, and reporters were rushed into the room after the president had sent NATO essentially into an emergency session because of the president's comments about NATO. Then he came out to reporters declaring victory, saying that NATO had changed a lot over the 2 days and that the countries involved in NATO had agreed to up their defense spending. Now, that just doesn't seem to be true, John, because we are hearing from the French president, who is pointing to that joint statement that President Trump and all the other leaders signed yesterday, which only committed them to spending 2% of their GDP on defense spending, a pledge that they made years ago and agreed to hit by 2024. That is still the agreement from what the French president is saying. And that's also what the president said during that press conference. He started out by saying that they had agreed to pay more than what we had ever seen them pay before. They had agreed to substantially up their commitments. But then later on in that press conference, you heard from the president himself say that they had agreed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. That is not anything new here, John. That is what they had already agreed to do. So it's unclear why the president is declaring victory and saying that they're agreeing to spend more because they had already pledged to meet that 2%. Now, to be clear, a lot of the countries are not at that 2%. A lot are actually far from it. They have until 2024 to meet that goal, but a lot of them aren't on track to meet it. The president is saying that they will be meeting 2%. He said he doesn't doubt that they won't meet 2% of their GDP on military spending. But that is nothing new than what it was before the president showed up in Brussels. That was already what they had agreed to do. So really, they are just repeating their pledge here, despite the president saying otherwise. Now, we also saw some stunning statements from the president really committing to the NATO alliance, saying that he has great faith in them and that they are a fine-tuned machine. Listen to what he said during that press conference about it, which sounds a lot different than what he said just a few days ago.
The United States has been paying a tremendous amount, probably 90% of the cost of NATO. And now people are going to start, and countries are going to start upping their commitments. So I let them know. Yesterday, actually, I was surprised that you didn't pick it up. It took till today. But yesterday, I let them know that I was extremely unhappy with what was happening. And they have substantially upped their commitment. Yeah. And now we're very happy and have a very, very powerful, very, very strong NATO, much stronger than it was 2 days ago.
Now, the White House said yesterday that the president suggested to these countries that they up their defense spending to 4% of the GDP, a standard that not even the United States meets yet. But it is not clear that any of those countries committed to doing that. So if the White House does say that, it is not clear that any countries have committed to spending far beyond that 2% of their GDP. So to sum up, essentially, John, the president created this crisis within NATO, sent them into an emergency session, held this last-minute press conference declaring victory without making any clear statements about what it was that he had changed about NATO. And now he is wheels up, headed for London for another meeting that will also be highly scrutinized. John.
All right. Thank you so much, Caitlin Collins in Brussels. I appreciate it. Again, the president on his way to the United Kingdom, where I am right now. Joining me, CNN chief international anchor Christiane Amanpour. Also with me, Luke Harding, foreign correspondent for The Guardian. And Christiane, we're trying to get to the bottom of the facts here because things just aren't clear, despite what the president said in his 40-minute news conference. And he did say some things that are flat out not true. He said that the United States defense spending makes up 90% of NATO defense spending. That's just not true. It's somewhere around 70%. He said he earned new commitments for increased spending from NATO members. We cannot determine if that is, in fact, the case. The French President Emmanuel Macron said they agreed to nothing more than to what they had already agreed to. What are you hearing?
Well, we hope to reveal all to you shortly, because I do have an interview with Jens Stoltenberg, who is the NATO Secretary General, as we all know, famously, who faced off with President Trump in that breakfast meeting, and who was obviously in the room and will be able to tell us the precise parameters of what happened. But you can see already there is confused reporting about it. However, French media are reporting that their president, Emmanuel Macron, said there's no change to the roadmap that calls for the countries to up their spending to 2%, that famous 2% that was agreed back in 2014 and that should be implemented by all members by 2024. Apparently, there's no change in that. There's no agreement on a 4%, according to individual leaders, and that was sort of pulled out of thin air. Nobody quite knows where that came from. What is interesting is that President Trump, throughout all the sort of bluster and the me, myself, and I, and NATO's stronger than it was 2 days ago when I arrived here, what he did say is that NATO is vital, NATO is strong, and NATO is unified. Those are important words to come from the President of the United States, yes, particularly as he heads off to Russia.
That NATO is vital line, I am so glad you brought that up, because he did say it clearly. He did say NATO is vital, and in a way it's the first time we have heard it over the course of these 2 days, as he's been highly critical of NATO allies and specifically critical of Germany. And let me bring you into this discussion. The context of this news conference was we understood that the Secretary General called an emergency session of NATO leaders today. And inside that session, the president was threatening his allies, saying that the United States will do its own thing. I will do my own thing, the reports are, if you do not increase your defense spending.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing, that he was going around the table berating people, particularly the Germans, the French, the Canadians, for
one
not
by
meeting
one,
their
I'm
commitments.
told.
One by one, almost telling them off like a kind of schoolmaster, saying that they hadn't done their homework. This is not normal, John. This is an astonishing state of affairs. This is unprecedented in the sort of 70 years of Western security architecture. And I think what's interesting is, as Donald Trump comes to London, as you say, is there's a big question for Theresa May and others. Is Donald Trump's America an ally of the United Kingdom, or is it some kind of an enemy? And I think there's extreme nervousness here as to what will happen and what the president will say next.
I will tell you what you just said. The president would agree 100% with the first half. This is unprecedented. We have not seen this before. Donald Trump and his supporters would just say, yeah. And we're getting what we want out of this, which was a greater commitment to defense spending from our NATO allies, something that past presidents haven't been able to do.
Yeah, but the shadow hanging over this trip is, of course, what's happening on Monday when Trump is meeting with Vladimir Putin. And I have to tell you that the KGB has spent decades trying to think up plans as to how to divide America from Europe, how to kind of split or fracture NATO. And Trump wanders into Brussels, holds an emergency press conference, and he does precisely that.
And it's a good point. Of course, you were stationed in Moscow for a long time. You know what you're talking about here. Christian, on that point, on Vladimir Putin, some fascinating language and a couple of points I want to bring up here. Number one, the president would not rule out accepting Russian annexation of Crimea. He was flat out asked about it, won't rule it out. And the president won't rule out canceling joint NATO exercises with the Baltics, which are so important to those states which fear Russian incursions. And specifically on Vladimir Putin and whether he would bring up election meddling, what the president said is, all I can say is, did you, and don't do it again. Is that true?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, obviously there's a lot more that the president can do. And one of the things he can do is go into a meeting fully squared, shoulder to shoulder with the NATO alliance, so that there is an impregnable wall of Western democratic military and security alliance. And that is what the allies were hoping for. On the issue of several issues that you just brought up, it is very difficult to see how that is going to, be a win-win situation. Canceling joint maneuvers with the Baltic states, who were the front line, as you correctly mentioned, of butting onto the former Soviet Union and being aggressed. There has been so many tests and probing over the last few years by Russian aircraft and personnel and others into certain, breaching certain Baltic frontiers and airspace. All that kind of aggressive stuff has been going on. To cancel joint exercises, it just almost reminded me of what he said to Kim Jong-un. Okay, we'll cancel joint exercises with South Korea, but what do you get in return? So this is a big issue if that does happen. And then the idea of accepting the annexation of Crimea, well, none of the Western allies accept that, and nor did the Deputy Secretary of State, who I interviewed just before this trip. He said absolutely not. The United States position is absolutely clear. Crimea is a part of the sovereign nation of Ukraine, and that is what we as the United States believe. So there are mixed messages going on. My fear, John, is that we tend to be missing the big picture in all these little firecrackers and major firecrackers that the president keeps throwing out successfully and distracting and deflecting successfully. So the big picture, as for instance Victoria Nuland told me yesterday, she was a former ambassador to NATO, is that these few days, the summit in Brussels, the summit in Helsinki, in her words, will determine whether the United States of Donald Trump will bolster American leadership around the world or whether it signifies its death knell. That is important. In other words, kill it off. Those were her words. And we have to keep that in mind. That is the paradigm under which all of this is happening right now.
And again, I think that was the concern that we were hearing 2 hours ago while this emergency session was going on. All of our phones were going off with text messages from people connected to it with the word that the president was threatening to go it alone, saying he would do his own thing if he did not get his way. And then the White House had to put out a statement. Our Jeff Zeleny reporting that senior officials are saying, no. The United States does want to stay in NATO. That's a remarkable thing for a senior official from the administration to have to say. That is not supposed to be in contention. Luke, that's supposed to be a layup, as is U.S. acceptance of the annexation of Crimea. Any Western leader should just say, no, we're not going to accept that.
Yeah, that's right. And if I were a leader of a Baltic nation today, I would be extremely anxious because Trump has already equivocated about Article 5, this common defense treaty. If, let's say, Lithuania or Latvia is attacked or subverted, then NATO allies should all jump in and help. Now, Trump seems to be kind of rowing back from that. And there's a context to all of this. We had a war in Georgia in 2008. We had annexation of Crimea in 2014, and really a covert war launched by Russia in the east of the country, in which 10,000 people have died. This is in Europe. This is where we're talking now. And we also have a history of Putin doing something rather unexpected after major sporting events. Bear in mind the World Cup ends on Sunday. So I think all eyes next week, once Trump and Putin leave, will be to see what the Kremlin does next.
This is not an abstraction for Ukraine. This is not an abstraction for Georgia or the Baltic states. And we should say the president arrived late, 30 minutes late to the scheduled meeting at NATO today that was designed initially to discuss Russian aggression toward Ukraine and Georgia. He arrived late to that meeting. Christian, the president in the air right now coming here to the United Kingdom. You talk about the big picture here. You talk about the notion of whether or not the president will disrupt the world order. Part of that world order, yes, it's NATO, but part of that world order is also the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. Talk to me about the status of that special relationship and what might happen here over the next 2 days.
Well, look, you're absolutely right. I mean, it used to be a given that the relationship between the United States and Britain was solid, rock solid, even through differences of opinion on war, peace, and other such things. But shoulder to shoulder has always been the term that both sides have always used. We actually haven't heard that much since the inauguration of 2017. And we've seen instead President Trump actually consistently tweet against Prime Minister May, taking and picking huge fights with the mayor of London, gratuitously, Sadiq Khan, talking about, meeting an essential, I don't know how to phrase it, but a backstabber of the Prime Minister, the former Foreign Secretary, who has resigned over disagreements that we thought he had agreed with. All of these things are very troubling. The Brits would love to have this special relationship stay solid because it transcends a person and it's about trade, security, and all those things. So they really, really need this relationship to continue. But look, the Europeans have started to say that America first is the new, it is America alone to an extent. It is America isolating to an extent. They believe that President Trump is consistent in not worrying about maintaining the integrity of the Western alliance and laying the groundwork, whether it's strategic or not, but in his own mind, for pulling back and doing certain things on a purely bilateral and transactional way, rather than in a multilateral alliance way, as has been the case for the last 70 years.